Your father passed away in 2008, and what do you think about the more present Formula One? Because of course it wasn't still too much modern compared to today, but it was clearly very different from the 60s.
Yes, and you know, my father was always remaining a big fan of Formula One. Even though, you know, it changes every year, it changes very little every year, you know, so it sort of evolves and you get used to the new changes. It's only really, I think, when you look back at an old race 20 years ago, you realize how much things have changed. So he always enjoyed watching the races. He would speak of the differences sometimes. I think he had a very nostalgic sort of idea of what motor racing was. When he was racing, there were no sponsorships even on the cars. It was only a red car with a Ferrari badge on the front and a number. And there, you know, as the sport became more commercialized, and the whole sport, you know, became more televised, so much more money came into the sport. So he came from a very different time, more simple times in Formula One. But of course, they were so much more incredibly dangerous. And I think it was maybe hard for him to relate to the modern day race car driver. Like he could remember what the sport was like for himself. But I've never heard him say bad things about it. And you know, no, he was working for a company sometimes that he would be the host and he would take a group of people over to Europe and they would get to visit the factories like the Ferrari factory and see the Grand Prix cars. And they would go to the Italian Grand Prix or the Belgian Grand Prix or the British Grand Prix, even the Le Mans 24 hours. So he was always still staying involved in the sport.
In 1961, your father became world champion, but on that same season, his friend Wolfgang von Trips tragically passed away, and I wanted to know how was their relationship and how did feel after that race.
Yeah, I mean that was maybe the most unbelievable mix of emotions that any human could experience. I mean, because for my father, yes, he was friends, but you have to ask really how close of a friendship can you have with one of your biggest competitors, right? So they maintained a mutual respect. They actually shared many interests. My father was alone when he was in Europe. Really, he didn't have family over there. And Wolfgang von Trips and his parents were very welcoming to my father. He would go over and visit. Von Trips lived in a castle in Germany, and he would visit the Von Trips estate. But really, as I think the pressure got more and more and more, these were two men who both wanted the same thing very badly. They both wanted to win the world championship. And in 1961, it became clear that as the season went on, that one of them was going to be the new world champion. And at that point, America had never had a world champion. And also Germany had never had a world champion. So there was a lot of pressure, not only on my father, but on Wolfgang von Trips. So when he won the race in 1961 in Italy, I know it was the most, for him, the best feeling you can have. You've achieved the biggest goal, something you never even imagined could happen. And of course, back then they didn't have the radio in the ears. So no one was telling him that Von Trips had been killed. And yeah, he saw wreckage, he saw burning wreckage. There were like 5 Ferraris, I believe, entered in that race. He didn't know which of the Ferraris had crashed. I think he saw Jim Clark's car that was also involved in the crash. Well, they were used to car crashes a lot, and they were used to drivers perishing in these races. It was just part of what that whole era was all about. But when he finally learned, not too long after the race ended, from his race engineer, Carlo Chitti, that Wolfgang von Trips had died, I think it cast a huge shadow over him winning the title. And it's something that he had to live with the rest of his life. It was very, very bittersweet. But one thing you can't take away from somebody is an accomplishment like a world championship. And he carried that with him proudly for the rest of his life. But he also knew that it came with a big price, and that was losing his comrade, his rival, and his friend, Wolfgang. And so that was not easy.
I recently interviewed Justin Gurney, Dan's Gurney's son, and
Yes.
his father was another great American F1 driver. And did he and Phil know each other well? Do you have any stories about them since they raced together in Ferrari in 1959?
Oh, absolutely. My father maintained a very close relationship all the way until the very end with Dan Gurney, and they were both from California. In fact, Dan Gurney wrote my father when he was wanting to get into motor racing, and my father had already established himself as a driver. And Dan Gurney wrote my father a long letter and asked him, is there any way he could make any introductions or help him get a foot in the door. And my father asked him if he wanted to drive with him to the Sebring 12-hour race, which was a famous sports car race in Florida.
Yeah.
They drove all the way across the country together with another guy who was a friend of Dan's. And they imagine that driving all the way across the United States in an old car from the 1940s or 1950s. And they drove, and my father introduced Dan to Canetti, and Luigi Canetti was, the main importer of Ferraris at the time. And Luigi Canetti was also a racing driver. He had raced at Le Mans 24 Hours. I think he won Le Mans 24 Hours. And he was very aware of helping my father. And my father introduced Dan Gurney as a very, very good potential prospect. And very soon they were racing on the same team, which was exciting. Dan Gurney went on to do incredible things. And my father and him always maintained a very close relationship.
As well, I interviewed Amanda McLaren, the daughter of Bruce, and I know your dad was racing with him in Cooper in 1964. And did he have a particular memory with Bruce, and what kind of person he was, in his opinion?
Yeah, I remember my father sharing some stories about his time at McLaren. It was not very easy to race at Cooper. When my father left Ferrari after 1962, he ended up having some very difficult years. And as you know, you can be at the top of your career, but look at Fernando Alonso right now. He is now, struggling just to be at the back of the grid. It sometimes it really does come down to how good is the car at that moment. And my father struggled a lot with the teams that he raced with after Ferrari, because they just weren't really good teams at that moment. But he did get invited to go race for Bruce McLaren's team in what was called the Tasman Series. So during the winter, they would go race down in New Zealand, because the weather was, the summertime, it was better.
Yes.
And they had a whole series down there, right? And so my father was racing with Bruce McLaren, and this was in 1964 in the Tasman Series. And he was really having the best time, he said, of his whole racing career, because he was relaxed. He was with friends, and Bruce McLaren, he said, was really, really a fun guy to get along with. He remembered driving with the whole team, and they were going to one of the races. And he remembered, he told me this story, how they were very hungry, and they walked into this restaurant, and it was maybe just after lunchtime. And Bruce McLaren walked in the door, and and said, "Oh, we're so hungry, we'd like to buy some sandwiches." And the lady said, "Sorry, sandwiches are off." And Bruce McLaren yelled, "Well, and so are we." And he slammed the door, and they all went back to the car. And my father just would laugh thinking of these stories, running around with these guys. And he had really a wonderful time with Bruce McLaren, who went on to do so many interesting things in that period, including Can-Am and things like that.
I know your dad was very close to the two-time world champion Graham Hill, and I interviewed Brigitte Hill, that is Graham's daughter, and she made me read a letter that Graham wrote to your dad while in Zandvoort in 1971. What can you tell me about their relationship?
Oh, I mean, I know that Graham was such a personality, and such a big personality, and such an established British driver, and I know my father and him got along so well. I remember exactly the letter that Bridget was talking about, and I mean, imagine that, imagine a driver nowadays, and maybe they do this together, but real rivals, let's say, out there on the track, whether it would be Max Verstappen and Lando Norris, seeing a funny billboard or an advertisement in a magazine. And this letter she's referring to, Graham Hill seeing a packet of sugar with a little picture of my father's car on it. And the way, he wrote my father this letter, like telling him he's as sweet as sugar. They were all in the sport together during a very dangerous period. And in many respects, I think the drivers back then had to have more respect for each other, because out on the racetrack, one of them could just do a little mistake, and it could be fatal consequences for the both of them. And it's not like today where drivers are running into each other and, being so aggressive trying to dive into a corner. They had to drive with more finesse, and they had to be much more careful that they weren't going to touch wheels. Of course they did, but the consequences were so much worse back then. So I really think it created a whole different environment amongst the drivers back in the day.